She recently hosted an event for me at DC9 last month, and she's back this month to do Nerd Night. Her fun fact is that she once, and I'm very jealous of this, met Madeline fucking Langle. Right? Right? So basically you're getting a talk from Madeline Langle. I'm pretty sure actually you're getting a talk from The Next Better Thing. Because we've got a real-life current author in the room. You can pick up her book over there. Girl walks into a book. Please welcome to the stage, Miranda.
A great job of grabbing me the clicker so that I can walk you through my slides. How we doing? Let me just divide the room really quickly. Let me hear from Team Charlotte Bronte. If you are Team Charlotte, let me hear from you. And just so I know where the trouble is coming from, where is Team Emily? You guys are gonna hate this. I should have brought security. And Team Ann! Anybody on Team Ann already? A couple? All right. Yeah, that's, yeah, kind of, is Ann Bronte's subtitle for her life. But I'm gonna get you on Ann's side. Like, Charlotte's always gonna be closest to my heart. Rachel also forgot to mention when I met Madeline Langle, I was 7, I peaked early. She wrote in my copy of A Wrinkle in Time, she wrote, Miranda, Tesser well. Isn't that the best fucking thing? Alright, so we're here to talk about the Brontes behaving badly. I first came to Jane Eyre when I was 10 years old, and my father gave me a copy, and I was a little girl who liked to read, and Jane Eyre opens with a little girl who likes to read, and so I picked it up, and I dived into the first chapter, and I hated it! And I threw it across the room, but I read everything else in my house, so I came back to it, and just totally fell in love with it. It's the story of this young girl who becomes a governess, who goes and works in the house of a rich, sarcastic man, who she falls in love with, and they almost get married, but turns out he's already a little bit married, and his wife's in the attic. His wife's in the attic, and she's not well, and so Jane leaves, finds herself cast on the kindness of strangers, makes a life for herself, turns out she's an heiress, gets in some money, goes and finds Rochester, and this is when I first became interested in the idea of women behaving badly in literature. Because when Jane Eyre goes back to Rochester, spoiler alert at the end of the book, she doesn't know that his wife is dead, she doesn't know that he's injured, she doesn't know that he's available, she just knows, fuck it, it's Jane's time, I got my money, I'm going back! You guys are right here to learn all the wrong lessons with me, aren't you? That's great. So, I wrote an essay when I was in grad school about my life reading the Brontes, and then because I was in grad school, people were like, you should tell us more about that, and so the product is this. A girl walks into a book, What the Brontes Taught Me About Life, Love, and Women's Work, and I have copies for sale in the back corner. If you're interested, $15, PayPal, Venmo, or cash. I'm gonna put it down now. All right, are you ready? I'm so excited. Okay, so in case you were sitting here going, who? Repeatedly, here. Come on. What? Why would I do Saboteur! Right? It's because I'm shit-talking Emily Bronte. There we go, okay. So this is the entire Bronte family. You'll notice it has parents and a maiden aunt, like every good Victorian family needs. Hear it for Anne Branwell! 2 daughters died when they were 10 and 11 years old. Then there was Charlotte. Yes, it was very sad. It's been a while. I feel like we've healed. So Charlotte found herself the eldest, then her dipshit brother Branwell, Emily Jane Bronte, and Anne Bronte. And in case you're still needing more information, I've got their portraits. So Charlotte, the reluctant badass of the family, author of Jane Eyre, Shirley, and Villette, and the professor, but we don't have to talk about the professor. Emily, this is the fighting words, Empress of Overhype. Yeah, I said it, and I stand by it. There's gonna be a brawl on the roof after this, the first Bronte brawl in 200 years. And then Anne, chronically underrated, author of Agnes Grey and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is the most banana pants book, by the way. And then there's Branwell, who painted himself out of the portrait in a fit of self-loathing, which is appropriate. Author of his own destruction and an unknown member of Illegitimate Children. That's true. He lost more than one job by knocking up a housemaid, this bastard. All right, so the Brontës behaving badly. Some of you may be thinking, I don't think they did anything that bad. I think they were perfect and you're wrong. That's fine. This is a space for disagreement. I actually agree with you. But you know who didn't think they were perfect? Who did think they were behaving badly? Charlotte Brontë. She was very self-conscious about being a woman writing on purpose with ambition. She was very self-conscious about the fact that she was for sure writing about people that she knew in real life. She and some of her writing activities landed them scandal adjacent. Yeah, when you hear what the scandal is, you're gonna be like, that was it? That freaked you out? Okay, Char, settle down. Railing against marriage! Every single one of these novels has some shit to say about marriage, and none of it is good. Which we have a much higher tolerance for now in 2018. But when they were writing in the 1840s and 50s, you didn't write a romantic novel that was also like, by the way, men are terrible. Marry them if you have to. And the fifth step we'll get to when we get it. It was a little bit scandalous that they were like, we are women and we are going to make our living writing and that's what we're going to do. This is also just a South Park joke. You guys remember the underpants gnomes? I girls eat. All right. The women writing with ambition aspect of the Brontës behaving badly. So you really can't underestimate how revolutionary the Brontë sisters were. They came about 30 years after Jane Austen, about 30 years before Mary Shelley, and they had women that like wanted to have jobs and wanted to marry for love and get some money. You really, I mean, you can't downplay, yes, snaps for marrying and also having money. You really can't downplay that, but again, Charlotte Brontë was very uncomfortable with the idea of being coarse or unnatural or unwomanly or having a bad reputation, and so she needed a story that would explain how she and her sisters came to write these ferociously misbehaving books. And this is what they came up with. The legend that was well-meaningly propagated by her friends, particularly the novelist Elizabeth Gaskell, after she died, was that she and her sisters were just sitting around the living room after they'd all come home from their various jobs at governessing and hating children, and Charlotte was like, hey Emily, what's that stack of paper? And Emily was like, oh, they're just poems. I don't know. And Anne was like, you know, actually, I wrote some poems too. And Charlotte was like, I bet they're not as good as my poems. And then they put all the poems in a stack and they fell into the mailbox and then they emerged at a publisher and somehow 6 novels followed, but it was an accident. They were so innocent, they didn't know what they were doing. This is bullshit. They knew exactly what they were doing. Here is a timeline that tells you how. Charlotte, Branwell, Emily, and Anne were writing from the time they could hold an ink, whatever they were writing with. And you can see that's an example. When you and I were all reading Highlights and Ranger Rick and Muppet Babies, they were reading a magazine. Ranger fucking Rick! They were reading a magazine called Blackwoods, which was kind of like the New Yorker, but in Yorkshire. Heyo. I'm not sorry. You know what? I'm not sorry. And you can see from that tiny little magazine how tiny it was and that they imitated the typeface. And then in 1830, when Charlotte was 14, she made a catalog of all her books thus far. So you know she was writing from at least the age of like 8 or 10. Right? And then in 1836, when she was 20, she and her brother Branwell wrote a letter. They each sent poems to this guy named Robert Southey, who's a dick, and he wrote back, literature cannot be the business of a woman's life, and it ought not to be. The more she's engaged in her proper duties, the less leisure will she have for it, even as an accomplishment or a recreation. What's happening? But she wrote him back a really interesting letter. She was like, oh my god, thank you so much for looking at my poems. I think that you are so right. I should definitely not spend any more time on it. But you didn't say that I was bad. You just said that I should do other stuff. So she switched to novels. And 4 years later, 4 years later, she wrote to Hartley Coleridge, another poet. And this time she didn't let on that she was a woman. She was like, my name is C. Townsend, so take a look at my novel. He wrote back that he found it unlikely to find a publisher. But he also gave her some more useful feedback and said he speculated a little bit if like she was really a man. And she wrote back this bizarrely sarcastic letter that was like, if you think I'm a sissy, you should check out Charles Dickens. What the fuck? Charlotte, that's rude! So, having done all that legwork, having gone abroad, having thought about opening a school, but realizing again they really hated children. Like one of their teachers was like, our old school's closing, we can give you the keys, the furniture's in there, all you have to do is go there and teach. And they were like, we have to go to Belgium. I really wanted to take over that school, but I have to go to Belgium. I'm so sorry. They did not want to teach a school. They hated children. It was great. So they packaged up their poems, they shopped around, they found a publisher that would print them at their own expense. They used their inheritance from Aunt Branwell, who had died by then, and they sold 2 copies. That's about on par for a debut volume of poetry, I have to tell you guys. And then a year later, they shopped their first 3 novels around. Originally, The Professor, Agnes Grey, and Wuthering Heights were each supposed to be 1 volume in a set of 3-volume novels, which is how they did novels, because I don't know. And so, but Wuthering Heights was 2 volumes long, so The Professor got bumped. And Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights found a publisher together, also at the author's own expense. Charlotte got so fed up shopping The Professor around by herself that by the end, she sent it to 12 different publishers, and by the end, she was just crossing out the address on the paper and writing in the next address. Not the first impression you really want to leave. But she got such a nice rejection letter from Smith, Elder & Co. to The Professor that she was like, I wonder if you'd be interested in another volume of more ready interest from the same pen, and sat down and wrote Jane Eyre in about 2 months. And they were like, we will take it. But this is how biographers reacted. Like, they saw this and were like, weird that these girls came out of nowhere. They were so sheltered. Like, it must have just been like a series of monkeys and typewriters. It was not. It was on purpose, and we should all feel great about that. The next Brontes behaving badly category is a little bit of a scandal within the Bronte scholar community, because there are people that want to just take the literature as the literature and not look for evidence of the Brontes' real lives. And I get that. That's a perfectly defensible take. The work is the work, the lives are the lives. That's totally fine. I do have a couple small counter-arguments. For one, Jane Eyre was called an autobiography. Jane is not a real person, but I think we can sort of look further for clues. Because you know who else thought that Charlotte Bronte was writing about real people? All the people Charlotte Bronte was writing about. They were all writing under pseudonyms, so nobody knew who they were. So within their earshot, in their little town in Yorkshire, they'd be like, did you hear about that book that talks shit about our school? Like, they 100% knew. Also, Mary Taylor, Charlotte's best friend, who, by the way, you should really research some more on her, because she looked around at the options available to her as like a medium-born woman. She could either be a seamstress, a governess, or get married. She was like, fuck it, I'm going to New Zealand and opening a store. And she did, and so now we have all these great letters from Charlotte and Mary when she was in fucking New Zealand. Like, who even knew New Zealand existed in 1847? I didn't. But she was like, hey, remember that time that a guy got shot in Shirley? You put him in the wrong back bedroom at our house. This is not a direct quote, but that's basically what she said. Also, other people who thought the Brontes were writing about real life, the Brontes. Anne Bronte said in the preface to The Ten and a Wildfell Hall, Agnes Grey was accused of extravagant overcoloring in those very parts that were carefully copied from the life, with a most scrupulous avoidance of all exaggeration. Also, Charlotte Bronte, defending the really grim parts of Jane Eyre, was like, it is true, and truth has a severe charm of its own. Had I told all the truth, I might indeed have made it far more exquisitely painful. So not only is it true, but it could have been so much worse, you assholes. All right, next up. Being scandal adjacent. I had to cut 3 slides here from time, so I'm just going to talk even faster. This is the dedication page of the 2nd edition of Jane Eyre, which Charlotte dedicated to William Makepeace Thackeray, author of Vanity Fair and other novels of the period. She loved his work, but there was a slight problem because people were already suspicious of the Bell brothers because they were writing under the names Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell. And they were like, are these all the same guy? Because I don't think a guy could write women this well. Is it a woman? But I don't think a woman could write like this at all. So who are they? And so she dedicated her work to William Makepeace Thackeray. And I want to remind you, Jane Eyre is a book about a woman who falls in love with a wealthy man who has a crazy wife in his attic. Unbeknownst to many, but not all of London society, William Makepeace Thackeray was a wealthy man who lived in a townhouse and had a wife in the attic, and she was not well. So immediately London society was like, Kerr Bell's a woman and she's Thackeray's mistress! Charlotte Bronte was mortified because she was a huge fan of his, obviously. Fortunately, Thackeray had read an advanced copy of Jane Eyre and stayed up all night and cried and loved it and wrote a really lovely letter about it. And then they got to have tea. Her editor, George Smith, invited him over. And Charlotte sat down, William Makepeace Thackeray, her idol, and told him what she thought was wrong with every one of his novels. She wrote this hilarious letter that was like, yep, I just confronted him with all his faults and he defended himself in a way that was worse than the original offense, but we're gonna have dinner, it's fine. And they did. He invited her to dinner thinking she would be this literary lion, you know, full of opinions and sass and like super bitchy about other people's writing. But she wasn't. She went and she saw a lecture and she just sort of hunkered down. And this was partly because she was shy, but partly because it was really important to her to be taken seriously as a woman. She had to come out to her publisher as a woman because of the aforementioned scandals. And so she was just too... So in a way she's behaving well, but in our looking backwards, we're like, couldn't you have just fucked up one dinner party, Charlotte? Couldn't you have just flipped one table? The answer was no. But the fourth thing, railing against marriage. So here for this. So these are the 3 books that we're going to look at. And yes, Wuthering Heights has plenty of bad things to demonstrate about marriage. Agnes Grey has really pointed social commentaries about the shallowness of rich people and why they get married. But The Ten in a Wildfell Hall, Shirley and Villette have some of the best anti-marriage propaganda of any Victorian novel you will ever read. First, The Ten in a Wildfell Hall. So the plot of this one, it's banana pants. Okay, it lives inside. It's an epistolary novel, which means it's a series of letters. But Anne Bronte didn't make it a set of letters between 2 people. It's just one dude writing letters for 54 chapters. Problematic. But it's about this young, beautiful girl who falls in love with a rake and marries him, and then he turns out to be adulterous and an alcoholic and abusive. So she runs away, which is unheard of, and hides from him, and then goes around telling all the women in the neighborhood, like, don't get married. And this is a quote from her aunt at the very beginning. And she says, keep your heart in your hand in your own possession till you see good reason to part with them. And if an occasion should never present itself, comfort your mind with this reflection, that though in single life your joys may not be very many, your sorrows at least will not be more than you can bear. Marriage may change your circumstances for the better, but in my private opinion, it is far more likely to produce a contrary result. Read The Ten in a Wildfell Hall. It is batshit. Next up is Shirley, the gayest of all the Bronte novels. Shirley was a boy's name before this book. Okay, that is how powerful this book is. And one of the heroines is Shirley, who's a landowner, and she runs around making all this social commentary, such as, all men taken singly are more or less selfish, and taken in bodies, they are intensely so. She also conducts a different character who kind of is plucked straight from an Austen novel to be disappointed by Yorkshire, is researching old maids, and she's having this conversation with a servant. She goes, I think old maids are a very unhappy race. And she goes, not they, miss. They can't be unhappy. They take such care of themselves. So then she goes into her town and does research. She's like, okay, there are 2 kinds of old maids. Because she's asking herself the question, who am I? What is my life for if I'm not going to get married? Because she fell in love and then immediately gave up. And so she's like, there's 2 kinds. There's the sweet, generous kind that everybody makes do all their work for them. And then there's the bitter, sarcastic, angry kind that everyone's too afraid of to bother. Raise your hand if you figured out which kind of old maid you're going to be. All right, so that's Shirley. Villette, look how done Lucy Snow is on the cover of Villette. She's like, I'm out of here, I'm almost off the cover, I'm out. This is my favorite. So Villette is the story of, again, another young woman who washes up in Brussels, which is Villette. It's Brussels, shut up. And she gets a job at a school, falls in love with a co-teacher, and then at the end, he falls in love with her, takes her for a walk, kisses her real good, and then puts a set of keys in her hand, turns her around, and goes, here's your school. This is Charlotte Bronte's like big romantic ending, that he falls in love, proposes, gives her an establishment, and then leaves the country for 3 years. But what she also said, because it ends on a cliffhanger, you don't know if he makes it back. And so Charlotte Bronte wrote in this letter, it was designed that every reader should settle the catastrophe for himself, according to the quality of his disposition, the tender or remorseless impulse of his nature. Drowning and matrimony are the fearful alternatives. The merciful will, of course, drown the guy to put him out of misery. The cruel-hearted will, on the contrary, pitilessly impale him on the second horn of the dilemma, marrying him without ruth or compunction to that person, that individual, Lucy Snow. Spoiler alert, but these books have been out for like 150 years. This is on you guys. Alright, so the fifth one is not actually profit. It is actually the fact that Charlotte Bronte burned a ton of unpublished material. Yes, exactly. This is the only one that I think in 2018 we're like, aw, did you have to? Like, we believe when women write with ambition now, right? We believe when they tell their stories. We're here for it when the scandals are stupid. We're like, it's fine, Ariana Grande, you're great. And we're for sure here, as tonight has demonstrated, for railing against marriage. But when Emily, the other thing you might not know about Charlotte Brontë is that within an 8-month period, first Branwell died after a long battle with alcoholism, opium addiction, and just being a shithead. At his funeral, Emily caught a cold, died 2 months later. Anne held on for about 5 more months and then died in Scarborough by the sea. So this was also 1 volume into Shirley. Charlotte Brontë had written this like historical romp about a bunch of girls hanging out in parks, and then everybody died. And she was like, how do I finish this book? The second volume of Shirley is weird, and then it sort of levels out. But this takes us back to the beginning, right? She was so concerned with like the reputation of herself and her sisters that she wanted to protect it at all costs. So she burned what may have been Emily's second novel. She burned all of Anne's letters. We just don't know anything about these other 2 sisters. Her husband, she eventually did get married, and her husband was really concerned about her legacy because she was already pretty famous, and he was trying to convince all her friends to agree to burn her letters. So he told her, such letters as mine ought never be kept, they are dangerous as lucifer matches. Right? I really want to read the letters that didn't make it. But the letters that did make it do contain like literary fire like this. This is her talking shit about Jane Austen. An accurate daguerreotype portrait of a commonplace face, but no glance of a bright, vivid physiognomy. I should hardly like to live with her ladies and gentlemen in their elegant but confined houses. Oh, shit. This is not, she also wrote this letter to George Eliot's boyfriend. Like, this is not a restrained gesture. But I'm extra sad that the letters we don't have didn't make it, but extra glad that she was writing mostly to her friend Ellen Nussey, who was like, absolutely, Arthur, I will totally burn these. And then she like censored a couple things, and then she sent it directly to Elizabeth Gaskell, who promptly published them. So we get to have things like this, where she says, we all, except the arrogant and self-confident, despise ourselves very thoroughly sometimes. Objects of our own withering scorn, we have everyone been on occasion. A bad account, yet I believe there is hardly a human being breathes but might say as much. So next time you guys are feeling stuck in the throes of imposter syndrome, just remember Charlotte Brontë was right there with you. And this is a cartoon she drew of herself. She was actually a great artist, but that's what she drew on a letter. So if you guys are interested in more gossip and Brontë opinions, please buy my book here or anywhere where books are sold. My name is Miranda K. Thank you so much.
Miranda, don't go anywhere. We're stuck here for their questions. Yeah, does anyone have questions for Miranda? We have time for like 3 or 4 questions. Just repeat the question when you hear it. Yeah.
What's your favorite thing about Anne Brontë?
Thank you! Thank you! My favorite thing about Anne Brontë is that she was the most fearless, because Branwell was doing all of his drinking and smoking and thrashing around being a broke asshole at their house. And she was the only one who would talk about it. And Charlotte was mortified. She didn't actually even want to publish a second edition of The Ten in a Wildfell Hall. She was like, it's just too crude, it's too coarse, it's too much. It's the fucking best. And Anne was the only one who would talk about it. That is my favorite thing. Team Anne, yeah, in the back there.
What's the deal with Emily?
Here are my feelings on Emily. I agree that Wuthering Heights has moments of badassery. I agree. It is also a mess narratively. There are about 8 people in it. He digs her body up out of the ground, you guys. I also think that Emily was doing a lot more tongue-in-cheek, like social satire than we realize. And I think 16-year-olds who take it super earnestly, like before we had Twilight and 50 Shades, we had Wuthering Heights. So you just need to understand the genre that we're talking about, right? Also, Emily didn't want to be famous. She didn't want to do any of it. She was the main reason that they wrote under pseudonyms. So I just wish Emily had been a little more, you know? Like, go harder, Emily, or don't go at all. But not with the grave robbing stuff. Too much. One more? Do I have one more? I get 2 more. Huh?
Did Mary Shelley ever say anything about Brontës?
Ooh, she probably did. I haven't written that book yet, but really, anybody who is anybody, right, has to like account for the Brontë sisters in some way. I think for sure she did, because I think she really continued a lot of what Emily Brontë began with Frankenstein, you know? So I bet she did. Yeah.
Could you just very briefly connect this generation of women to the next generation of women authors?
Ooh. Never ask a nerd to connect generations of anything. Well, here's one of the things I love. So one of the first pieces Virginia Woolf ever published was about a visit to Haworth. She went to Haworth, where the Brontes were from, and then promptly wrote an essay about why no one should make sentimental journeys to places where authors live. Which I think was a lot about Virginia Woolf being like, nobody else go here, I like it. So So I think every generation of, like, the writers I think of are mostly Virginia Woolf and George Eliot. And if you really love George Eliot, there's a book called My Life in Middlemarch, which does the same kind of project that mine does, like growing up, reading a work and getting involved with the author's life. I think the Brontes made it easier for women after them to be more scandalous, to be braver, to write in the first person, to try more things. I think because they did it all on their own with no structure and no support. Nobody, the only person in their village who knew they were writers were the people who sold them paper. Because they were like, you guys are buying a lot of paper, huh? So for years, that's how it was. And I think they made it easier to be women of good reputation in the world so that other women didn't have to have such good reputations. Yes, thank you to all of us. Yeah.
Wait, no, wait. Can you go to the slide of the imposter from your last slide?
Oh, yeah. I had so many of these. I love her letters so much. They published in 3 giant volumes edited by Margaret E. Smith, and she found a way to basically replace all the information that Elizabeth Gaskell censored. There we go. It's so good. She would really, I mean, she struggled with depression, with anxiety. She was like too lonely if she went to town. It was too noisy and bustling, but then she would go home and just be with her father when everybody was dead. And she was like, I don't know what to do. I think that's very relatable too. She found a way to write through depression and to write some of the most gorgeous books, you know, that I've ever read. Jane Eyre changed my life for sure. Every chapter is about a different book, and all of them taught me good lessons and bad lessons. Do we have one more? Yeah. Yeah, there's a bouncing. Yeah, you, with your hand up. You.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so they talk a lot about, just railing against marriage and everything in the institution, but what do they specifically say about men, or do they just relate all men to how bad it is?
What do they specifically say about men, or do they just relate all men to how bad marriage are? Well, it really depends on the book. Jane Eyre has more of like, why don't women get to do more stuff? But Shirley has this heroine, Shirley, who literally goes toe-to-toe with like the local troglodytes and is like, what is it you think women can't do? I read the newspaper, asshole, bring it. Like, she gets people to call her Captain Keeldar, you know? Like, so it really depends. Shirley has a lot more of like the specifically feminist social commentary. Villette has a lot more subtle stuff. Like at one point the main character's in drag and just comments on how cool it is to wear pants and then moves on and never mentions it again. Did they have pockets? You know? Pockets, that's all we want. Miranda Pennington and I endorse pockets as a pants strategy. Thank you guys so much.